Where is the FX3 Mark II? It's been 4 years since the FX3 was first introduced and 5 years since the A7S III, which shares the exact same sensor. And because I've heard this question so many times and more often as time passes, I want to explain to you why I think that Sony is taking so long and give you some predictions on when I think we're going to see the FX3 Mark II. Hey, by the way, my name is Matt Johnson and I make videos about filmmaking, video editing, and I should probably get into beard care tutorials at some point. Now, to explain where the FX3 Mark II is, we need to start by talking about really how Sony works as a company. Sony, like all mega corporations, has a lot of divisions underneath the main brand. So you have Sony Movies, right? And you also have Sony Music, which makes a lot of stuff. And then what do people think about whenever they think of Sony? They think of PlayStation, of course, because come on, I have one. It's great fun. You got to think about PlayStation. But for the sake of this video, we need to talk about the camera divisions, and there are actually 2 of them. Up first, you have Sony's sensor division, which is actually called like semiconductors, but yeah, that's their sensor division, for which we'll be calling it in this video. And then you have the cameras division, which is, as you would think, A7S III, FX3, things like that. Now, you may think that these 2 are the same things, but while they are connected, they are completely separate in many ways. In short, the sensor division designs and manufactures camera sensors. Some of them go into Sony's camera division, but the vast majority of them go to other companies to be put into their separate products. Companies like Apple, which, fun fact, every single camera sensor used in all of the iPhones comes from Sony's sensor division. Or you have companies like Nikon and Panasonic, which, fun fact again, the Z6 III and S12 sensors, among many others, are also from Sony's sensor division. But what you need to be aware of is that these companies don't just take the basic sensor design from Sony and throw it into their camera. They're able to heavily customize the sensor as well. There are a ton of modifications that these companies can make to these sensors to make them look unique and differentiate them from each other. So that way they don't always just look like a Sony sensor. Some of the underlying technology will be the same though, like the resolution of the sensor, whether it is stacked or partially stacked, backside illuminated, etc. I don't want to get too into the weeds about this. My main point is that Sony's sensor division is always creating and designing new camera sensors, and then they are selling them to a lot of other companies, as well as to Sony's camera division too. So that brings us back to the initial question at the start of this video. Where the heck is the FX3 Mark II? And I promise you we are almost there. Stick with me. With what you now know about Sony's sensor division and how that works in collaboration with Sony's camera division, that is now much easier to explain, because while Sony's sensor division is able to make camera sensors for all these other companies, from what I've been able to see, they're also able to save some of their cutting-edge sensor technology for use exclusively in their own cameras. That is why the A7S III was able to hit such a high ISO, as well as record in 4K at 120 frames per second, and why the A9 III was one of the first mirrorless cameras with global shutter. Sony's sensor division works very closely with their camera division. In addition, because Sony is making the sensors, unlike Nikon or Panasonic or even Apple, who have to essentially pay Sony every single time that they use one of Sony's sensors, Sony's camera division still has to pay the sensor division for a sensor, but they're the same company at the end of the day. And while every division has to be profitable, they're basically just transferring money from one division of the company to another. Sony still gets all that money. More importantly though, and here's the big smoking gun, let's say, that leads us into, as filmmakers, a full understanding of Sony's strategy as far as camera sensors go, because Sony owns the camera business as well as the sensor business. They are really incentivized to sell as many cameras as possible using their sensors. And what is one way that they can maximize the amount of sensors that they're selling? Sony can sell a lot of variations of the same sensor. Here's how that works in a nutshell. Sony will create one camera sensor. Let's say it's the one used in the A7S III in 2020. Then 6 months later, they will release the FX6, a cinema camera that uses the exact same sensor. And 6 months after that, they will release the FX3, which also, again, uses the same sensor, but it's in a different mirrorless body with a fan to prevent overheating and some extra mounting points that's more focused on filmmakers. And then 2 years later, what do we see? The ZV-E1. And what is that? Sony yet again using the same sensor, but this time it's inside an even cheaper body built for vlogging and content creation. This same sensor used 4 times, selling dramatically more cameras and sensors than if they had just released one body. And then consider that Sony is doing this with all of their different camera lines at the same time. So you have the FX30, right? Which is sharing a sensor with the A6700. You have the ZV-E10, which is sharing quite an old sensor at this point with the A6400, A6500, 6600, 6100. It's crazy, okay? You have the A7R5, which is sharing a sensor with the R4 and the A7CR, and now the RX1R Mark III. And then you also have the A7 IV, which is sharing a sensor with the A7C2, not crazy. And what is that? The FX2. A camera that a lot of filmmakers were confused about why the heck Sony would be offering a filmmaking focused camera from their cinema line with such a poor sensor with rolling shutter. Good question. But if you think about it in terms of Sony's sensor division has already built the sensor, which is really the toughest part to build of the camera, it's relatively easy and way cheaper at that point for them just to put it into another body like the FX2. Sony essentially takes one sensor and then puts it into as many bodies as possible to hit as many different niches as they can. And as a prediction, I don't have any inside knowledge or anything like that, but looking at their strategy here, there are really only 2 product lines they've made that do not have a cinema or vlogging version. And that would be the sensors that are in the A1 and the A9 III. Side note, the A1 and A2 share the same sensor. So if we're going to do that, we're going to be like A1 II there. If you want to say, hey, those are together, right? And the A9 III is over here on its own. And so from what I've seen, the A9 III sensor seems to be quite expensive, so it may be limiting them from putting into other cameras. But here's my point. I don't think that Sony making an FX version of the A1 II and A9 sensor is an if. I think it's a win. And I would not be surprised if we saw an FX camera that used the A1 sensor that records in 8K or an FX camera with a global shutter. Sony is really incentivized to make these cameras, and I'm betting there are a lot of filmmakers out there that would buy them. Tell me that you would not take an A1 II that records in 8K, but that also has a fan so it won't overheat. You would consider it. I know that I would. Bring things back to the FX3 Mark II then, because we're like, Matt, that's great, that's cool, thanks for explaining the strategy, but where is the camera, right? Well, we had 2 questions at the start of this video. Where is this camera and when will it be here? Well, if we look at all of the sensors that Sony has created, and we consider that they all have these sub-product lines where they release a hybrid camera, then a filmmaking specialized cinema camera, then a filmmaking hybrid camera, then a vlogging camera. All of their current cameras are coming from sensor technology that is 4 to 5 years old at this point. The original A7S III sensor, 2020. The A7R5, what is that, 2019, I think it is, or maybe 2018 because it's the A7R4 sensor. ZV-10's using a sensor from 2016, I think. Crazy. This is at least newer. FX30 sensors 2023, 2022, A7 IV 2021. You see what I'm saying here. The newest sensor that Sony released was the A9 III in late 2023. And then, if you consider that Sony is not making a sensor that they're planning on putting in one camera, like just the FX3 Mark II, but they want to make a sensor that's going to work with all of these product lines that they're making, meaning that it's going to need to work in a hybrid A7S IV body, a vlogging ZV-E1 Mark II body, a larger cinema camera FX6 Mark II body. And suddenly it starts to make sense why the FX3 Mark II is taking a while. Because unlike with their current generation of sensors, where where I feel like they sort of stumbled upon these different marketing opportunities for them to make variations of the cameras that use the same sensor, like a vlogging version, etc. Sony's going into this next generation of camera sensors fully having it all planned out. Remember, the more versions of these cameras that they sell, the better that Sony's sensor division is going to do, so it's a very symbiotic relationship there. They're incentivized to release a lot of these camera versions. If we look at the gap between the A7S II and the A7S III, A7S II came out in October 2015, and then the A7S III came out in August 2020. So you're looking at a 5-year gap. Well, here we are in 2025. It's been another 5 years, and there's no A7S4 or FX3 Mark II or anything like that. And so what this tells me is that this generation may end up being 5.5, 6, or 7 years long. But I think that looking at Sony's strategy in this way makes a lot of sense why we're still waiting. And if I had to guess, my prediction is that we're not going to be waiting for much longer. 2026, 2027, we're going to start seeing all new sensor designs for a lot of these product lines that are finally going to be coming to fruition, and it's going to be happening sooner than you think. And maybe you don't need to be asking, where's the FX3 Mark II? Maybe you should be asking for an A7S4 or a ZV-E1 Mark II that uses the same sensor. Let me know if you agree with my take on Sony's sensor strategy in the comments, and while you're down there in the video description, I will link to my filmmaker gear guide that's going to show you all of the current equipment that I recommend for filmmaking. I'll also link to my A7S4 and FX3 Mark II wish list video that I made that lists all the features that I would love to see with the camera. Please like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you loved it. Thanks so much for watching, and have a great day.